Top tip number 1. Middle C does not get its name from its position on a piano. Middle C is not in the middle of a piano. There are actually 23 white notes before middle C and 28 white notes after middle C. The middle of the piano is situated between the notes E and F, just slightly right from middle C, although middle C is the closest C to the middle of the piano. Middle C gets its name because it sits on its own line right in between the treble and bass clef staves. The line is coloured blue here so it stands out. The note is placed on it and then the line is made shorter to fit the size of the individual note. I always joke with my students that middle C is the king of the notes. Top tip number 2. Use landmarks to remember note positions. This is a treble clef. It circles line 2, which is where the note G is placed. This is why it is also called a G clef. This is the note G, which is placed on line 2. And here's its position on the piano. The bottom of the clef also looks a bit like a G too. As we know, middle C sits in the middle of the treble and bass clef staves, on its own line. Let's draw this now. This is a bass clef. It starts on line 4, which is where the note F is placed. This is why it is also called an F clef. And here's its position on the piano. The dots are also positioned either side of the F line. You can imagine the letter F touching the dots to help you remember. The corresponding G clef and the F clef notes are symmetrical to each other. Top tip number 3. Middle C acts as a crossover note between the staves. Here are the notes middle C with G in the treble clef and F in the bass clef. Let's slide them over. Let's add the notes from F in the bass clef to G in the treble clef and see how middle C acts as the crossover note between the clefs. Top tip number 4. Ledger lines are simply the treble or bass clef stave or staff line shortened. Let's start with ledger lines in the bass clef. Here we have our treble and bass clef staves with a crossover line for middle C shown in blue. Let's add middle C and then shorten the line to fit. The line that middle C sits on is called a ledger line. A ledger line is an extra line we have to draw which is not part of the 5 treble or bass clef stave or staff lines. Let's add the notes moving up in pitch via the line space pattern until we reach high C. Now we need to add the C ledger line for all of these notes. Let's shorten the brace which connects the treble and bass clef staves together and remove the treble clef, as these notes will be shown as ledger lines in the bass clef. If we shorten each of the normal treble clef stave or staff lines, the notes magically become ledger line bass clef notes. Now watch the magic happen. If we want to write treble clef notes above the bass clef ledger line notes, we need to extend the brace and add the 5 lines of the treble clef above. Let's do this now. Now let's look at ledger lines in the treble clef. Here we have our treble and bass clef staves with the crossover line for middle C shown in blue. Let's add middle C and then shorten the line to fit. Let's add the notes moving down in pitch via the line space pattern until we reach low C. Now we need to add the C ledger line for all of these notes. Let's shorten the brace which connects the treble and bass clef staves together and remove the bass clef, as these notes will be shown as ledger lines in the treble clef. If we shorten each of the normal bass clef stave or staff lines, the notes magically become ledger line treble clef notes. Now watch the magic happen. If we want to write bass clef notes underneath the treble clef ledger line notes, we need to extend the brace and add the 5 lines of the bass clef stave or staff below. Let's do that now. Top tip number 5. Middle C looks different in treble and bass clefs, but it's actually the same note. As we have already seen, middle C is the crossover note between the bass clef and the treble clef. However, middle C usually splits like this, with middle C and the treble clef being situated under the stave or staff, and middle C and the bass clef situated above the stave or staff. As we saw earlier, we need to be able to fit ledger line notes in between the staves, so the 2 middle Cs are split up, one for the treble clef stave or staff and one for the bass clef stave or staff. Here is an example of how ledger line notes are written, leading up or down from middle C. And this is how it started. Top tip number 6. When you're learning to read notes, remember that all Cs are symmetrical. Is this something you have ever noticed? Did you realise that splitting them up so one was placed below the treble clef stave and one above the bass clef stave made them symmetrical? Have you ever noticed that when we place low C on the 3rd space down in the bass clef and we place high C on the 3rd space up in the treble clef, this makes these Cs symmetrical too? And have you ever noticed that when we place very low C 2 ledger lines down below the bass clef stave and place high C on 2 ledger lines above the treble clef stave, this makes these Cs symmetrical too? You can view my full video on symmetry and music by visiting my YouTube channel. Let's have a look at the symmetrical notes of C. Let's add the mirror so you can see the symmetry more clearly. Top tip number 7. We don't have to use acronyms and mnemonics to remember note positions. OK, so let's have a look at the positions of the notes we've learnt so far. We've learnt that the treble and bass clef notes of middle C are symmetrical to each other. We've learnt that the landmark notes of G in the treble clef and F in the bass clef are also symmetrical to each other. We've learnt that C on the 3rd space up in the treble clef and C on the 3rd space down in the bass clef are symmetrical to each other. And we've learnt that high C positioned above the treble clef stave and low C positioned below the bass clef stave are also symmetrical to each other. We now know all of these notes without a mnemonic or acronym in sight. Now let's swing the notes round so we can see the symmetry. Now let's add the mirror to make it even more clear. OK, let's put them back in pitch order. This gives us a fair few landmarks to be able to work out where the other notes are positioned. Let's do it now. not an acronym or mnemonic in sight. Top tip number 8. Sharps and flats aren't just the black notes. If you are a musician, you are likely to know that each black note has a flat name and a sharp name. This is because the flat name and the sharp name are enharmonically equivalent to each other. Essentially, this means that they are the same note. The first black note can either be called C sharp or D flat. The next black note can either be called D sharp or E flat. The next black note can either be called F sharp or G flat. The next black note can either be called G sharp or A flat, and the next black note can either be called A sharp or B flat. These notes then repeat. But have you ever wondered where E sharp or F flat and B sharp or C flat are? The basic principle of a sharp or flat is that you move right by one semitone to reach a sharp and left by one semitone to reach a flat. This means that if we move left by one semitone from F, we must reach F flat. And if we move right by one semitone from E, we must reach E sharp. Therefore, this also means that if we move left by one semitone from C, we must reach C flat. And if we move right by one semitone from B, we must reach B sharp. Therefore, sharps and flats aren't just black notes. Top tip number 9. Move right for a sharp, move left for a flat. There's much more to it. But we can't call it a flat and a sharp at the same time, so how do we know which one to choose? We actually use sharps or flats depending on which makes the music easiest and quickest to read. This is how we labelled our piano for top tip number 8. I'm going to show you the notes of a major scale. We are going to write the notes in 2 ways, one using sharps and one using flats. I want you to decide which version is the easiest and the quickest to read. Okay, so we're going to complete 2 enharmonically equivalent scales, G sharp major and A flat major, and then we're going to see which one is the quickest to read and understand. The first 2 notes are fairly easy to understand. The first note can either be called A flat or G sharp, so let's add these notes to the start of our scales. The second note can either be B flat or A sharp, so let's add these notes to our scales. The third note is a little bit more tricky. This note can either be called C or B sharp, so let's add these notes. The fourth and fifth notes are fairly easy to understand. Note 4 can either be C sharp or D flat, and note 5 can either be D sharp or E flat. Note 6 can be a bit more tricky. This can either be called E sharp or F. Let's add this to our scales. Now, note 7 is the hardest of all. This one can either be called F double sharp or G. Let's add this to our scales. Note 8 has the same names as the very first note, so let's add these to the scales. Let's take a closer look at our enharmonically equivalent scales. The top scale is the scale of G sharp major, and the bottom scale is the scale of A flat major. We have created 2 different scales which consist of exactly the same notes on the piano. Which scale do you think is the easiest to understand, read and play? G sharp major or A flat major? The first notes of G sharp and A flat are as easy to locate on the piano as each other, and the same goes for the second notes of A sharp and B flat. But when we come to the third note, the scale of A flat major contains the note C, whereas the scale of G sharp major contains the note of B sharp. I think everyone would agree that the note of C is easier to locate and understand than the note B sharp. Notes 4 and 5 are as easy as each other to locate and play, but when we come to note 6, the scale of A flat major contains the note F, whereas the scale of G sharp major contains the note E sharp. Again, I think everyone would agree that the note of F is easier to locate and understand than the note E sharp. And when it comes to note 7, I think 100% of people would agree that the note of G is easier to locate and understand than the note of F double sharp. I think we can safely say that writing this scale as A flat major by using flats is preferable than writing this scale as G sharp major using sharps. If you are doing music exams on piano, this is why you will be asked to play A flat major rather than G sharp major. Even though these scales contain exactly the same notes and are enharmonically equivalent to each other, the scale of A flat major is considerably easier to understand than G sharp major. This is exactly why the same notes have a flat and a sharp name. Top tip number 10. When sight reading, don't worry about naming the note, just know where it is on the piano. In this video we have talked about landmark notes and how you can use these notes to find any other note. However, you don't really need to know the letter name of the other notes you need to find, you just need to know where they are located on the piano. Let me show you what I mean by using our clef landmark notes of G in the treble clef and F in the bass clef, as well as the symmetrical notes of low C and high C. OK, so let's see if we can find this note on the piano. The important thing to remember is that we don't need to know the letter name of this note. The closest landmark note to the note we are trying to find is C. Our note is one note higher than C. Now let's see if we can find this note on the piano. Our closest landmark note to this note is F. Our note is one note higher than F. Now let's see if we can find all four of these notes on the piano. We're going to need to compare these notes to both of our landmark treble clef notes, so let's colour the G line in red and the C space in yellow. The first note is one note higher than G. The second note is two notes higher than C. The third note is one note lower than C. And the fourth note is two notes lower than G. I have found them all just by knowing where the notes of G and C are on the piano, and I haven't mentioned any of the note names. I hope this video has given you some helpful tips on how to read music.